Today's webinar is titled ActiveTrans Priority Tool, a model methodology for prioritizing pedestrian and bicycle improvements on existing roads. And we will be speaking with Michael Hintz, Associate Senior Planner with Toole Design Group, Bob Schneider, Assistant Professor with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Jim Elliott, a Transportation Planner with Toole Design Group. My name is James Gallagher, and I am the PBIC's Communication Manager. I will be facilitating today's webinar. This webinar has been submitted to AICP and may be approved for 1.5 CM credits. The Road Safety Academy, the training and education arm of the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, is a registered provider of CM credits. For more information on the Road Safety Academy, please visit www.rsa.unc.edu. And for more information on future webinars or to view the archives from this webinar series and others, please visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You also can stay abreast of PBIC webinars by following us on Facebook at facebook.com/pedbike. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and in improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at pedbikeinfo.org/gettraining. Now I'd like to welcome and thank Michael, Bob, and Jim for their presentations today. We'll take questions at the end. Michael, please take it from here.
Well, thanks everybody for joining today. We're really excited to present the ActiveTrans Priority Tool, a flexible, data-driven methodology for prioritizing bicycle and pedestrian improvements along existing roads. This project, or this tool, is the end product of a National Cooperative Highway Research Program study that was conducted. That's study 0717, and we were tasked by NCHRP to develop this methodology to evaluate and prioritize pedestrian and bicycle facility improvements on existing roads. That project is wrapping up. We anticipate acceptance by the NCHRP review panel this month, and that all products will be made available in the first part of 2015. And at the end of this presentation, we will tell you more about what those products are and where you can get them. Before I jump into it, I want to just acknowledge our project team, some other folks that worked very hard on this project that really spanned 2.5 years or more. Of course, many people at Toole Design Group, and then our partners, very close partners at Kittleson and Associates, really helped us out on this project. And then Bob Schneider, who's also on the phone today, really helped us with the research component. And I just want to say that I think we're just excited about this tool. We really think it's a top-notch tool that will help agencies prioritize pedestrian and bicycle improvements. So with that, I'm going to advance to the next slide here. This is what we're going to discuss today. I wanted to start off by providing some context. Why is it important to prioritize pedestrian and bicycle improvements, and how the ActiveTrans Priority Tool, which we're going to start referring to as the APT, just to make it short, can help agencies do this. And then I'm going to hand it over to Bob, and he's going to talk a bit about the research process that went behind, that was conducted to develop this tool, just to give you an idea of sort of the rigor behind it. And then he's going to hand it back to me, and I'm just going to step you through the framework of the APT. And then Jim is going to finish it off by walking us through an example of how the APT was applied in a real-life scenario with the city of Phoenix. And then walk us through the spreadsheet tool, which I think a lot of you are going to be really excited about. And we'll discuss more about that. So why is prioritization important? Well, probably obvious to a lot of you on the phone. We work in an environment, a fiscally constrained environment, and there's a need to make cost-effective investments. Now, prioritization methods for standard roadway improvements are fairly well established, but NCHRP and other researchers and experts in this field recognize that there was a lack of methodologies for focusing on pedestrian and bicycle improvements. So that was the impetus of this project. So prioritization allows us to make the most out of limited resources while also choosing to make infrastructure investments in a way that reflects community values, political priorities, and provide the greatest benefit. And that's really built into the APT tool, this ability to incorporate stakeholder input, and then also to communicate prioritization, the end result of the prioritization process. So what is the ActiveTrans Priority Tool? As I mentioned, it is a model methodology for prioritizing pedestrian bicycle facility improvements. And it consists of a number of materials. There's the APT guidebook, which is really the framework that a user would refer to step through the prioritization process. And along with that, we've developed a program spreadsheet and user guide. And this spreadsheet is really intended to help agencies implement the APT methodology. So we've done a lot of the work for you, and it's a matter of plugging in your data and getting results out of that. And there's a number of other materials that you see here on the screen, which we, like I said, will let you know where and when you can download those materials. So uses of the APT, it's really set up to address pedestrian and bicycle improvements separately, but it can be used as part of a complete streets prioritization process, and Bob is going to talk a bit more about this when I hand it over to him. The APT can be used by state, regional, and local agencies, and it may be applied once or maybe applied iteratively to get more refined results. And Jim, when he talks about the Phoenix example, he's going to touch on how it was applied in a more iterative fashion. One thing I will point out that this tool will not provide guidance for determining pedestrian and bicycle facility design solutions. So, for example, it will not help you decide the appropriate crossing treatment or the appropriate bicycle facility that you should install along the roadway. So why prioritize with the APT? I think these 4 points here are really the key things that this tool is going to deliver for you. It's transparency. It's really designed to facilitate transparency by breaking the prioritization process down into a series of discrete steps, each of which can be easily documented and explained to the public. It's also very flexible. It was designed to work for agencies at all levels of government with different prioritization purposes and different levels of technical capacity and experience. That was something that we really, and Bob will get into this, we found in our survey that we conducted and conversations we had with agencies. You know, obviously every agency is at a different level in terms of their technical capabilities. So this tool is really meant to work with various levels. It's also very responsive, and that's designed to reflect the goals and values of the agencies or the communities that use it. So this ability to really integrate stakeholder input and choose factors that are most important to that community. So the APT was developed based on an extensive research process, and I'm going to hand it over to Bob just to talk a bit about that process and how the APT is really built on best practices. Let me hand it over to Bob here.
All right, I'll look for the presentation coming over here. Thanks very much for the intro, Michael. Is my screen showing up yet?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
Great, thank you. So we wanted to make sure that our APT tool was based on a good understanding of the state of the practice for pedestrian and bicycle prioritization, and really to create something that would be useful for practitioners. So we did several data collection, or several efforts to gather that background information, looking at previous NCHRP projects, FHWA reports, and other academic articles on prioritization. We did a review of plans and other documents that had information about prioritization from 47 different jurisdictions throughout the country. Some of these prioritized pedestrian, some prioritized bicycle improvements, and some did both. We also had a 40-question agency survey that we got 453 responses to, and it took up to 1 hour to complete. So we actually had 179 individuals complete the entire survey, and 274 completed most of it. So we got some great responses. Some of you who are on the call probably filled it out, so we really appreciate that. In addition, we got these responses were from a variety of levels of government. So we had city and county agencies represented, MPOs, and state DOTs. We wanted to make sure that what we were creating would be useful for agencies with slightly different missions and different jurisdiction responsibilities. We had 19 telephone interviews that we conducted with a variety of communities to follow up and find out a little bit more in-depth information about how their prioritization worked. Why were they doing prioritization? How did they collect their data? How did they decide which factors they should adopt into their prioritization processes? 8 of those interviews turned into case studies that we wrote up in the report. Once we were done with this initial data collection, we got some really good feedback from the panel on the direction that we should take the methodology, and ultimately developed a methodology that was based very much on this previous research and would work in practice. Michael's going to tell you a lot more about the details of that, but there is one other aspect of the research process that was important. Once the method that we developed initially was ready, we did a pilot test of that method in a number of communities throughout the country. There were 6 local agencies, 3 county agencies, and 1 state DOT, you can see there. And we refined the method based on the experience of those communities. So we really took their advice and the challenges that they had and the good things that they said about the tool and made adjustments so that now it reflects those experiences as well. So overall, from our state of the practice review through the survey and interviews and that process, we found that prioritization is very common among agencies, though many of the prioritization efforts, even if they're documented in plans, may be only mentioned in a few sentences or in an appendix in the back of a plan. They aren't particularly well documented, so we wanted to do this project to help increase the knowledge about how prioritization is working. There are many different methods that are being used throughout the country. They look at different types of factors that are important for prioritizing pedestrians or bicycle improvements. And then there are different weighting processes that are used to say really what's most important to some communities versus others. But one thing that we found through the process was that most of the agencies who'd been doing prioritization were using similar frameworks. So generally, they were balancing the needs for improvements, for improving things like safety and connectivity and equity. And they were balancing that versus the feasibility of doing projects. Was there funding through a grant opportunity or through a repaving project to do an improvement? And so that balance was part of the prioritization that we wanted to work into our tool. Some other things that we found were that pedestrian and bicycle modes were sometimes prioritized separately, and our tool allows you to prioritize the different types of infrastructure improvements in separate ways for each mode, but they can also be prioritized together, and that's what previous agencies had done. There are some key differences between pedestrian and bicycle prioritization in the practice, though. Pedestrian prioritization was often focused on smaller areas geographically, often emphasized safety since pedestrian crash data was a common type of data used in those methods, whereas bicycle prioritization often looked at connectivity and wider networks throughout a region. So there are some differences between the two types of prioritization. The goals that are established by agencies ultimately impact the different types of factors that are being considered and how much weight is given to those. We heard from many respondents to the survey that the methods that they used lacked the data that they would really like to have, and for those that were able to gather some data, in some cases it was hard to collect data in the field or to find it from secondary sources. So we wanted to make sure to have a method that could accommodate agencies with a variety of resources in terms of ability to get data. And we also noted that the data collection and analysis technologies are evolving quickly, so there's new methods to evaluate the suitability of roadways, for example, as well as the advancements in GIS technology. Many agencies now can do much more with a small amount of resources using those sorts of tools. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't reinventing the wheel. We're basing our method on previous practice. And we want to take advantage of some of the common factors that are used in a variety of agencies and provide those suggestions to agencies to use in this tool. But we wanted to also include flexibility so that you see a range of options for factors that can be included, but you may not want to use all of them in your community since you have certain goals that are more important than others. As Michael mentioned earlier, from what we saw, we didn't have great information about the details of the approaches, but we think that this method can help make the prioritization process much more transparent to the public and make it a lot easier to describe how you went through a detailed, rigorous process to prioritize. We also noted the need for some common language for talking about prioritization, and Michael will get more into that, and to offer more guidance for practitioners when they're at key decision points in the process. One last thing that was raised through our survey responses was the issue of complete streets. If an agency simply makes pedestrian and bicycle improvements as a part of other roadway projects and they don't have any separate funding pots for sidewalk improvements or bike lane improvements that are on their own, then some people said, well, if we're just doing it as a part of those other projects, it's not really prioritization because we don't have to think about it. It just happens whenever our transportation improvement program gets to that street. However, one thing to think about is that it's possible to influence the overall transportation programming by saying if a project has more pedestrian and bicycle elements that your community cares about, then that type of project may get a higher weight in the overall transportation programming process. So we think that it can also work even beyond the complete streets and complete streets approach and be complementary to that. So I'm going to turn it back over to Michael to tell you a little bit more about the specifics of the act.
Great, thanks, Bob. Yeah, so the APT guidebook that I mentioned earlier, it consists of 10 steps. Oops. And those steps are organized into two phases. The scoping phase, which is the initial deliberation and preparation necessary to set up the prioritization process. And then there's the actual prioritization itself, which is doing the calculations and coming up with scores for each of your projects and locations. So what I'm going to do is just walk through phase one, starting with phase one here, and describe each step at a fairly high level. I don't want to get into too much detail. We just don't have a lot of time to do that. But I want my goal is just to communicate what the tool has to offer, and hopefully intrigue you enough to go and check it out for yourself. Before I jump into that, I do want to just describe some key terms that we use in the methodology, and Bob's already used some of them, factors and variables, but just so everybody's on the same page. when we're talking about this and when Jim is stepping through the example. So improvement locations, that's the specific intersections, roadway segments, corridors that you're hoping to prioritize. Factors are the general categories that are used to express the community or agency values. It's basically how different variables are grouped, such as some examples are equity and demand. Variables are characteristics of roadways, households, neighborhood areas, etc. Some examples, population density, sidewalk presence. So variables are those things that you can actually measure. And then weights are numbers used to indicate the relative importance of different factors. And again, this is going to be based on community or agency values. And it's real, as you'll see shortly, that's a real key thing about the tool that allows you to play around with weights and explore different scenarios. And then finally, the process of scaling. It's making variables comparable to one another. So bringing speed, which is measured, in small increments, 10, 20, 30 miles per hour, and something like APT, which might be measured in thousands, bringing them into a common scale so that they can be compared. So phase one, this is the overview of phase one. It starts off with defining your purpose, and it's so what is it you're prioritizing? What are some of your goals? Then you select factors based on that, establishing factor weights, selecting variables, assessing data, and then finally assessing your technical resources. Are you able to do what you are setting out to do? And I'm just going to walk through each one of these steps. And I just want to point out that in this phase, it can be fairly iterative. The outcome of a later step, so you're selecting variables, but then you figure out you don't have the data to represent all those variables. You may have to go back and explore what variables you're using. So it may be kind of an iterative process. Defining the purpose, so really what mode are you prioritizing? This, you probably know this going into the process. Are you going to be doing pedestrian improvements, bicycle improvements, or both? What are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Maybe this is defined in a master plan document, or you've had some public process already, and you kind of have some clear goals that you want to represent in the prioritization process. Improvement specific or not improvement specific. So does the agency have a specific type of improvement in mind, such as sidewalk retrofit or bicycle lanes, or is the aim to identify locations where improvements are needed, but determine the type of improvement later? So, for example, roadway segments to receive ADA improvements. And then the location type or the extent. What types or extent of improvement locations will be prioritized? Are the locations confined to one spot or area, like an intersection, or are they entire neighborhoods or districts within a city? And then finally, the number of improvement locations. In general, how many improvement locations will be prioritized? And this may not be totally clear at the outset, or it may be very clear. You may have done a master planning process and you have 100 locations that improvements that you've identified, and you want to prioritize those. So that will become clear as you go through the process. So selecting factors is step 2, and as Bob described factors, these are really the categories used to express the community agency values, and it's really based on the common factors that we saw agencies using in the research that we did. So we have 9 factor categories, but the app is flexible enough that it will allow other factors to be used. And I'm not going to run through what each of these factor categories are. I think those will become more evident as we go and as Jim shares the example with you. But this is just an example of kind of what the type of information that the APT guidebook provides. So it has a lot of examples of different prioritization scenarios and the applicability of different factors for those scenarios. So as Bob mentioned, an agency may not use every factor for its prioritization purpose. And the guidance that we're providing in the app is really intended to help agencies work through what really is the most important, what are the most important factors for trying to achieving the prioritization purpose that the agency set out to do. So it's really a judgment call by the practitioner. The third step is establishing weights. Weights, again, are numbers used to indicate the relative importance of a factor. And a feature of the app that pilot communities really liked was the ability to easily change weights and see how different weighting scenarios affects the ranking, the ultimate ranking of projects. And Jim's going to demonstrate this later when he shows you the spreadsheet tool. The fourth step is selecting the variables. Again, variables are characteristics of roadways, households, neighborhood areas, and other features that can be measured. Bob mentioned the variables that we are have included in the app are based on the research that we did. And Bob's going to just talk a little bit more about that on the next couple of slides, how the variables, what research they're grounded in, because this is a really important aspect of the app. Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So for example, when we're looking at suitability as one of our factors, there are a number of variables that can be used to express that, and people could come up with a long list of potential variables, but we wanted to ground the variables that we suggest in the tool in some of the best research that's been done over the last decade. So for example, the pedestrian level of service tool that's in the multimodal level of service in the highway capacity manual that showed us that there were certain variables used in that tool and that those would be good to be considered for a prioritization effort. Other guidelines such as the FHWA crosswalk guidelines, pedestrian intersection safety index, crash modification factors also helped us identify variables that have been shown in previous research to be related to pedestrian suitability. So another example on the next slide is pedestrian demand models. So if we're considering the factor of demand, a number of variables could be used to represent that as well, but previous studies have shown that there are some very common factors, some very common variables associated with pedestrian demand, including population density, employment density, commercial retail property density, and proximity to transit stations. So those are some of the variables that we would suggest taking a look at in a prioritization process, and we show the references that those variables come from. So I'll turn it back to you, Michael.
Great, thanks, Bob. And this is just an example of again, of some of the guidance that's provided in the app's guidebook. Selecting variables really depends on your prioritization purpose, and obviously it's going to depend on the data availability. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And among the most important considerations for deciding which variables to use are the mode and the location type, or how you're going to apply those variables. Are you comparing corridors? Are you comparing areas, intersections? Segments and crossings may be more focused on specific are more focused on specific locations, and therefore more location-specific variables may be appropriate. So the guidance that's provided in the app kind of helps the user just walk through those deliberations and decide what variables may be most appropriate to use. Data. Data is a big one. It's often seen as a barrier to prioritization. Oh, we don't have the data. We can't do this. So what we've attempted to do in the app guidebook is, where the app is a really data-driven methodology, a major objective in developing the tool is to develop it so that it does not require agencies to go out and collect copious amounts of data in order to use the methodology. So we've set up kind of just a framework that you might step through to kind of assess your data needs, where you might have data gaps and how you might fill those data gaps. So starting out with kind of just inventorying what you already have. Seeking other data sources. There are a lot of data sources out there. Some obvious ones are U.S. Census data, but there's lots of other ones that could be used in this methodology. And then, if necessary, collecting new data. And I'm just going to walk through a couple things from the app that really shows you the type of guidance on how an agency might go about getting data for their prioritization process. So it just shows different. So for every variable in the app, we have some possible sources where you might get that data, and some of it obviously is only going to be generated locally. And some of it may be available from other sources. We also talk about, we have guidance for data collection. So as Bob mentioned, there are a lot of tools out there today that don't require a lot of resources, staff resources, and money to use. So for example, aerial imagery. There's a lot of data that you can collect just remotely sitting at your desk, and we have some ideas listed there. And then street level imagery is also available in most places, and there's a lot of information that you can gather just using street level imagery. And then of course there's some things that can only be collected directly in the field, and so we have that all listed out, and some a lot of resources on where an agency might go about getting data. And I'll say that if you just had U.S. Census data, you could do a lot with that using this tool. The last step in phase one is, again, assessing your technical resources. Do you have the capabilities to do what you want to do, measure the variables that you've selected, etc.? And like I said in the beginning, this assessment may have you go back and reassess your factors and the variables that you've selected. We also have an appendix in the guidebook that provides guidance on applying the app methodology using GIS. So a lot of agencies are using GIS, whether it's for just data storage, analysis, communicating results. We've provided a lot of guidance on how to use GIS with this methodology. Which brings me into phase two. I'm just going to run through this real quickly and then hand it over to Jim to walk through the example and the spreadsheet with you. So phase two, you're moving into actually doing the prioritization. You've gone through, you've deliberated, figured out what your purpose is, what factors you're using, what variables, what data you have available, and now you're going to set up your prioritization tool. And whereas phase one is maybe more iterative, phase two is definitely more linear. So the first step 7, is setting up your prioritization tool. And by tool, we mean some kind of way to store and analyze data. It could be a spreadsheet, which is what we've developed. So in a sense, we've already done the work for you. Or you may just be using GIS. We do recommend in the methodology that computations be done in a spreadsheet, because GIS doesn't preserve a lot of the formulas, and it's harder to go back and check for errors and understand the computations when just doing those in GIS. So we do recommend a spreadsheet or some kind of database tool. Step 8 is when you're inputting your data. This may be as simple as just copying and pasting from other databases that you have, or it may be a very manual process. This is definitely probably the most time-intensive step of the process. And then step 9, scaling variables. Like I said, getting all the variables on a common scale so that they can be compared and computations are making sense and not being heavily skewed by one variable versus another. And Jim's going to talk a lot about that when he shows you the spreadsheet tool. And then finally, you end up with your ranked list of improvement locations. And I think a big part of step 10 is being able to communicate those results, whether it's through maps or tables and graphs. But again, going back and making this a very transparent process and being able to communicate those results is really important. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jim, and he's going to walk you through the real-life example from one of our pilot communities, and also go through the spreadsheet tool with you. So over to you, Jim.
All right, I got it. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the pilot that we did in Phoenix. The city of Phoenix was one of the pilot communities and used the app to prioritize over 375 projects as part of its bicycle master plan process. The master plan was developed with the help of a consultant team that included Lee Engineering as the prime, Toole Design Group, and Charlier. The map in the background here was developed by Lee. Phoenix applied the app 3 times as part of an iterative process aimed at identifying the top priority projects. The consultant team used GIS to measure the variables and map results, but used the app spreadsheet to develop ranked priority lists. An iterative approach made a lot of sense for Phoenix, since the vision for the bicycle master plan emphasized developing a well-connected bicycle network linking people and places, which made it important to understand what corridors in Phoenix were the most important corridors for linking people and places, and what specific locations along these corridors should be prioritized for improvement. The following slides describe the iterative process Phoenix used in a bit more detail. In iteration 1, the consultant team used one factor, demand, to develop a heat map of latent demand for bicycling across Phoenix. Data for the variables came from the City of Phoenix and Valley Metro, stakeholder input in the form of a wiki map primarily, and the U.S. Census. The darker colors on the map illustrate areas where we would expect higher levels of bicycling. The city, working with a citizen advisory committee, identified 37 priority corridors linking these high-demand areas. In iteration 2, the consultant team used the app spreadsheet to rank the priority corridors into 3 tiers. Members of the consultant team worked with city staff and the citizen advisory committee to select factors and weight them. As I mentioned, improving connectivity to better link people and places was a key part of the vision for the plan. Therefore, the connectivity factor received the highest weight, a 10. Other factors included demand and stakeholder input. Because of the significant emphasis on building on the existing network, most of the top tier corridors had some level of existing bike facilities. In iteration 3, the consultant team used the app spreadsheet to identify top priority projects in the Tier 1 corridors. The consultant team worked with the city staff and with the technical advisory committee to identify appropriate factors. For this analysis, it was determined that all factors would be weighted equally. The emphasis was on closing gaps and bridging barriers in the existing bike network, which is why this step included the connectivity factor. You'll notice this list also includes variables related to the constraints factor, specifically order of magnitude cost and right-of-way availability. These variables were included because the City of Phoenix wanted to make sure that the priority list included projects that could be implemented relatively quickly. Iteration 3 resulted in 3 lists of ranked projects organized by tier, 1, 2, and 3, with the idea that the Tier 1 list would be used to identify projects for inclusion in the Phoenix Capital Improvement Program. I think one of the things that the ad hoc advisory committee and city most appreciated about the app was the level of transparency that the app brought to the prioritization process. They also really liked the app spreadsheet and the way that the spreadsheet makes it easy to determine how factor weights and scaling methodologies affect the final priority ranking, which is one of the things I'm going to show you next, as I give you a live demonstration of the app spreadsheet. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to close out of PowerPoint for a second, and I'm going to switch over to the spreadsheet. So this is what the spreadsheet looks like. It is a tool to help you implement the apps. It is not necessary to implement the app. That's an important thing to point out. But it's definitely built around the app and can be used to implement it. And it includes a lot of really cool features, which I'll show you in a second. One important thing to be aware of is that this spreadsheet includes some coding, and you'll have to enable that coding in order for it to work. So that's this button up here. You'll have to click Enable Content. And what that coding does is it, as you make your selections on the steps, and the app spreadsheet is organized according to the steps of the app. So from left to right, you'll see that the first tab here is Step 1, Define Purpose. The second tab is Step 2, Select Factors. Those correspond to the same steps in the app. As you work through those steps, the code in the spreadsheet will hide columns that are not relevant to your analysis. And so it helps streamline the work that you do that way. So I'm going to walk through all of this, and I'm going to show you kind of some of the key features of it. And hopefully that'll give you a good sense of what it can do. So this again is the first step, defining the purpose. And in the spreadsheet, that's represented by two questions that you have to answer. First is, what is the mode? And for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to select pedestrian. And you do that just by using the drop-down provided here. The second is, what type of location are we talking about? And there are a number of different types listed: intersection or crossing, roadway segment, roadway corridor, neighborhood or area. And I'm going to select intersection or crossing for the purposes of this demonstration. Now, as I just mentioned, these selections affect what shows up later on. So the fact that I've selected pedestrian here means that variables related to bicycling will not show up on future tabs. They'll be screened out. Okay, so let's move on to the Select Factors tab. So this is where you select your factors. And again, these are high-level categories that represent key values, such as safety, demand, or equity that you want to represent in your prioritization process. Variables fall within those categories and are measurable characteristics of roadways, neighborhoods, or areas. So to select your factors, all you do is you use the drop-downs that are provided here, and you flip them from no to yes. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to select just 3: stakeholder input, safety, and demand. Okay? And you'll see that when I skip over to the next step, which is weighting factors, that only those factors that I've selected actually show up. Now, Michael talked a little bit about what weighting is. It's a way for you to, for communities and for agencies to indicate their priorities. In the spreadsheet, this is really, the way this operates is as a number that acts as a multiplier. So the way things are now, by default, everything has the same weight, a weight of 10. But let's say that safety is more important for you. Well, how do you indicate that on this tab? What you do is you make the other factors lower. So I'm going to reduce stakeholder input to 7. So that's the multiplier, or the weight is only 7 for stakeholder input. And I'm going to reduce the demand factor to 5. Okay, the next step is selecting variables. And this page works much the same way as the factor select and the factor select page, and that you use a drop down and you flip it from no to yes. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to pick just a few variables. I'm going to pick the number of requests or comments. I'm going to select crashes. And I'm going to select, I'm going to move this over a little bit. Population density and proximity to attractor 1. I'm going to move this over so I can, the drop downs will work better. Oh. So you might ask, what does proximity to attractor 1 actually mean? Well, this is a placeholder that you can use for any type of attractor. And so I can erase what's here, and I can replace it with anything that I want. And in this case, I'm going to replace it with proximity to schools. And what I type in here will be carried forward to future tabs. And I can do that for any of the variables that are listed here. You can customize the variable names. That's one of the great features of this spreadsheet. Okay, moving on. We put in a few tabs that are just reminders to you of important steps in the process. So you see here that this, when I click on this tab, it brings up step 5, assess data. This particular sheet does not have any actual functionality. It's just a reminder that this is an important step in the process. So I'm going to move through these until I get to the input data step. Now, as Michael mentioned, this might be one of the most time-consuming steps for you, and you'll need to get the data, of course, and then you'll need to sort it, and you'll do that by using a unique ID, and then you'll need to put it into the spreadsheet. I have a set of data that I've already developed. I'm just going to plug in. Actually, I need to copy it over. And there we go. This is not real data from any particular place. This is just these are representative numbers randomly generated for demonstration purposes. So I put this data in, and the ID is sort of a unique identifier. This will be carried through for the remainder of the pages or the tabs in the program spreadsheet. Okay, so this tab is where you scale the variables, and scaling is very important, and you can see that by looking at the values that are in the top row here. So, you know, the value for safety for the first location is 3. Population density is 4,529. That's thousands of times larger. Unless we scaled these values, the demand variable, and particularly population density, would be much more important as a part of the overall calculation than safety. And we've said that safety is the most important thing for us. So that's why we have to scale these variables, put them on the same scale. The app spreadsheet makes this easy. All you do is you go to this box at the top and you select the methodology that you want to use. There are a variety of methodologies for scaling. I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail, although they are described in detail in the APT guidebook. And for the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to go with proportionate scaling for all of these. And I apply that by selecting proportionate. And I will go over and select it for all of the variables. Okay, and then I hit apply scaling. And hopefully it will work. Okay, so what this has done is it has put everything on a 0 to 10 scale. So, and it's kind of hard to see because there's that pop-up window, but for crashes, the highest value in this particular column is a 4. That's why it gets a scaled value of 10. We're using the proportionate scaling methodology. So the highest value gets 10, the lowest value gets 0, and everything else is slotted in between proportionately. Okay, so once you've done this, once you've scaled your variables, you're more or less done. The next tab will show you the scores for each factor, both the raw score and the weighted score. So the raw score is here, and this is the score without the weight or multiplier applied to it. And then the weighted score is here with the weight that you established in step 3 applied to it. And then the overall prioritization score is indicated in the rightmost column. Now you can develop a ranked list on the following tab, and all you have to do there is use the drop-down here to sort by number, and it will put everything in order. So you can see that the top ranked location here has the highest prioritization score. So you're done, right? You've done all of these, you've made these calculations and you're done. Well, we recommend actually going back and taking a look at the numbers to make sure there weren't any errors. You might also want to adjust some of the factors or use a different methodology for scaling. And the APT spreadsheet makes that easy. So if I go back here to the factor tab, and I change the weights. Let's say I decide, well, maybe safety is not quite as important as stakeholder input. Let's make stakeholder input the most important factor. I can do that here, and then I can go back to the ranked list at the end. And you'll see that there's a difference here. So the priority 1 ranked item is still in the first rank, but then it skips to 3 and 6, and 2 has fallen down the list here. So it has changed the overall scores for these locations. You can do this also for scaling, change the scaling methodology and see how that affects the overall prioritization score. And that's really one of the great things about this spreadsheet. It allows you to do that instantly. So that is the APT spreadsheet. It's one of several resources that we've developed for the APT. As Michael mentioned, there's also a guidebook which describes the APT methodology. There's a user guide that goes along with the spreadsheet, provides detailed instructions for using it. There's a screencast which demonstrates the APT, gives you, a very similar experience to the one I just gave you. There's specific guidance for utilizing GIS with the APT brochure, which provides a brief overview of the APT methodology. And finally, the NCHRP 0717 final report, which describes the research approach and findings that led to the APT. All of these resources will eventually be made available at no cost on the PBIC website at www.pedbicinfo.org/APT. I want to close by emphasizing the flexibility of the APT and the many ways it can help you. If you've never done this type of prioritization before, the APT explains how to do it step by step. If you have an existing prioritization process, the research that went into the APT and the way that the APT is structured might help you think about ways your existing prioritization process can be improved. If you're simply trying to find the areas in your state, region, or county or city that are most in need of improvements in walking and biking, the app can help you with this type of planning level prioritization. At the other end of things, if you want to prioritize improvements at specific locations, such as intersections or roadway segments, of course the app can help you with that as well. If you have available funds for specific types of improvements, for example, sidewalk retrofits, the app can also help with that. And finally, the app is a great way to engage stakeholders and express community values in prioritization decisions. If you'd like more information about how the app can help you, check out the executive summary of the app guidebook, which includes a chart with additional detail on each of these points. And that concludes the presentation portion of this session. Our contact information is up on the screen. James, I think we are now ready for some Q&A.
Yes, now we have some time for questions. If you've not done so already, please enter your questions in the question box on your screen, and we'll try to get to all the questions we can. The first question I got is, how soon will the tool be available for use on the APT website?
Yeah, I'll take this one, James. Like I mentioned in the beginning, we are anticipating that the whole NCHRP 0717 report and guidebook will be accepted by the NCHRP panel this month, and that we will be able to get, once that's done, all the materials up on the PBIC's website fairly quickly. So I think best case scenario, we're looking at January 2015 when things will be available. So please check back at that time.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How can the APT be used to prioritize a pedestrian and bicycle improvements together?
Bob, did you want to take that, or should I take that one?
Why don't you go ahead, and I may add to it.
Okay. So what the whole structure of the APT, as we've sort of demonstrated, is it really helps guide the practitioner through the different variables that might be applicable per mode. And in a lot of cases, the variables for, say, a pedestrian crossing improvement or a bicycle crossing improvement would be the same. So one way to consider those two modes together is to select variables that would apply equally to both modes. Another way, if you're, say, using the program spreadsheet that we've developed, is you could do an iterative approach. You could go through and have the locations, your improvement locations, and run through it using pedestrian-focused variables. And then you could do it again using bicycle-focused variables and factors. And then you could combine the results of those two iterations to get a rank list that reflects pedestrian and bicycle priorities. And I think, those are the main ways to do it. I think the guidebook really provides the information that helps you kind of work through those decisions about factors and variables that might be most applicable for each of those modes.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that. So like Michael was mentioning at the beginning, the panel and our project team had really good discussions about making sure that the tool could be used separately for pedestrian projects and bicycle projects, because there are very different characteristics of those different modes. But since agencies do sometimes prioritize together, we wanted to have that flexibility. And an example, a different type of example, is to think about the geographic scale that planning may be done at. And in Jim's example from Phoenix, they did a couple of different stages of prioritization. So you might, if you're doing a pedestrian and bicycle plan, do an initial prioritization that's at a very high level that may just try to identify a certain number of focus corridors to do more detailed analysis on. And then once you've identified a certain number of focus corridors, you can do a separate pedestrian prioritization and a separate bicycle prioritization for each of those and continue on your way.
All right, thank you. My next question I've got is, how is stakeholder input incorporated into the APT?
Yeah. So there's a number of ways to incorporate stakeholder input. One of it is just from the sort of the process that an agency follows. So, in the example that Jim shared in Phoenix, they involved a technical advisory committee and got input, and this was done in a lot of the pilot communities that we worked with. They went to the public to have them help decide what factors are the most important for their community. So that gets back to the sort of just the transparent approach to prioritization. Another way to incorporate stakeholder input is on the output end. You have that ranked list, and you communicate that maybe using maps or graphs or other visual communication, and have stakeholders weigh in on what the results are. Now, the app also suggests that for the stakeholder input factor, suggests a number of variables that might be used to measure stakeholder input. One, if you've done a survey or if you have a tracking system of requests or complaints, you can, and if you have that data available, you can input that as a variable into the spreadsheet or whatever tool you're using. Perhaps the projects or locations that you're prioritizing have been incorporated into a planning document previously. So, and maybe some haven't been. So maybe the projects that have been incorporated and have been identified as real needs, those get scored differently than projects that haven't been. So there's multiple ways that you can incorporate stakeholder input in the methodology.
All right, thank you. The next question. How can APT be used with combined street designs, and what impact does that have on overall prioritization?
Could you repeat that question?
Yes. How can the APT be used with combined street designs, and what impact would that have on overall prioritization?
I'm not super clear on what is being asked.
Well, maybe that questioner will add some more comments. In the meantime, we'll move on to another question. Is there an option to enter project cost to develop a cost effectiveness ranking?
Yes, absolutely. Under the constraints factor, project cost, if you have those available, it's definitely a variable that you can incorporate into the spreadsheet or whatever tool you're using to calculate your scores. So yeah, project cost is definitely a variable that you can incorporate.
So I'll add that we did look into this issue of cost effectiveness, and we brought in what we could to the tool. We're not saying that this tool can do a full cost-benefit analysis of an entire project. That goes beyond the scope of this sort of prioritization, but we did provide a number of resources about looking at cost-benefit in the guidebook.
All right, thank you. Is the APT set up to analyze off-road facilities and trails, or could it be easily adapted to do so?
Yeah, I'll take this. So going back to the sort of what we were charged with developing as part of NCHRP 0717, it really was focused on the conditions and variables that apply to roadways. It's really focused on retrofitting existing roadways. But that said, I think a lot of the factors and variable guidance that's provided in the guidebook could be applied to off-street facilities.
And this is Jim. I'll add that I think that the overall framework as well could probably be applied, less so maybe specific variables than the framework itself.
All right. Thank you very much. Our next question. What would the impact be on other improvements for traffic compared to pedestrian and bicycle prioritization?
So I'm not sure I totally get this, but let me just go out the direction that I think this question is headed. So I think that you could incorporate variables like if say you're making you want to prioritize bicycle improvements and you want to factor in what impacts there may be to other modes in the roadway. You could incorporate that into the process. For example, if putting in bike lanes requires removal of parking or some other modification in the roadway, you could factor that in as a possible constraint and have that reflected in your output. So maybe you want to focus on those roadways that don't remove parking in the outset, and you could have, if you've incorporated that as a variable, that would be factored into your results. Bob or Jim, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree with you that you could incorporate that constraint through the constraint factor. And it does bring up a point that Jim mentioned when he was doing his demonstration, but I think is really key for an advantage of this tool, which is that as you go through your process, and you may find that there are other constraints that are not listed in the existing spreadsheet, but the spreadsheet gives you flexibility to add new variables to describe those constraints. So, if you have to potentially take on-street parking away or have that constraint, you can add that as a variable and then assign the values to it. So it has that flexibility for you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question. Does the tool include adjustments for the length of the project? For example, a long corridor might have more collisions, attractions, etc., but a short corridor could have a far higher number on a per mile basis.
Yeah, Jim, I'll let you take that one because I think this was an issue that came up in Phoenix, correct?
Right. Yes, this did come up in Phoenix, and we used that experience to make some modifications to the APT methodology, the APT guidebook, to suggest ways that you can handle that situation. You can divide the crashes, for example, if it's crashes that that was the example given, by the length of the segment. That's one way of dealing with it. So the APT includes guidance on that particular issue.
All right, along a similar line, would a corridor approach, such as downtown segments, for example, help an organization complete whole systems, pedestrian and bicycle, with prioritized focus as opposed to prioritizing a shotgun approach?
What was the last part of the question? Prioritizing a shotgun approach?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that taking a corridor approach, if you're really concerned about connectivity and creating a connected network of corridors, I think connectivity would be an important factor to use. And yeah, I think you could have that as a heavily weighted factor, and as some of the variables that you include would be related to whatever the downtown corridors that you're doing and how they might connect to each other. I don't know. Anything to add on that, Bob or Jim?
I think it's one of those things that reminds me of the importance of the project purpose. Step one, identifying your purpose for prioritization. Some purposes may be to connect facilities that may have already been started in your community, but there's gaps, and so your purpose will lead to selecting certain factors and certain variables that are most important. If you're just starting out and trying to find a few opportunities to get in a new bike lane or to add some sidewalks as a part of other projects, you may have a very different purpose and then ultimately choose different factors and variables.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does this methodology work for ADA transition plan preparation?
I think that it definitely could help with that, in that it can help you identify focus areas or focus intersections where you need to really focus on prioritize where you're making ADA improvements. It won't, like I said in the beginning, it won't help you decide what those design solutions are. But yeah, I think that using factors like demand and safety and others that might be applicable to accessible infrastructure, it can definitely be used to help in developing a transition plan.
And one of the factors that we've included in the APT is pretty related to ADA transition plans, and that is compliance. I believe that one of the variables under compliance is whether or not a particular location is accessible or meets ADA guidelines.
All right, thank you. The demand and connectivity measures seem to be mostly based on proximity, for example, is a school nearby, and stakeholder input, for example, which corridors are most important. Do you have examples of projects that use network analysis to determine which roadway segments provide the greatest connectivity between specified origins and destinations?
So I think the question being asked is, could the network analysis be used as a variable in the process? And one of our pilot communities did do that. They had the capabilities to measure the network distance, and that was incorporated into their process. So I think if you have those capabilities to calculate network distance, most definitely it can be incorporated as a variable under the, it could be under the connectivity factor.
All right, thank you. Going back to the corridors a bit, does the tool provide guidance on how to define corridors, or is this left to the user?
Yeah, I think that's kind of left to the user. We define corridors as more than one street segment. So I think it really is going to depend on your street network, how you want to define that. And then, as Jim mentioned, the app provides some guidance on just how to factor in corridor length when.
I was just remembering that in addition to dividing by the length, we also suggest choosing corridors that are roughly the same length. So that's a way that you can address the problem of length and varying lengths by consciously setting out to identify corridors that are roughly the same length.
There's also a practical aspect of determining how long the corridor should be. If you're doing a prioritization of potential projects that are proposed with certain limits from this intersection to that intersection along this street, then you can define your corridors to match those projects so that you're more reflective of what's actually going to get implemented if you end up getting it ranked high on the prioritization list. That all goes back to the initial phases of scoping out the project to make sure you choose appropriate limits for corridors or whatever other analysis unit you're using.
All right, thank you. Is any guidance provided on the selection of relative weights, or does the practitioner simply use iterations and judgment to test sensitivity of weights?
Yeah, we really we don't provide, or the app does not provide guidance on the appropriate weighting. Really, that is left up to the agency or the community to decide. That is really the power of this tool is the ability to reflect those values. So it really is something that we don't provide a lot of or any guidance on.
Actually, there is some in there. It's not directly saying that you need to use certain weights because we do want to give that flexibility to communities. But in doing the background research, there are a number of tools like pedestrian demand models that have empirically figured out what weights were correct for a certain community. Now, those weights may not apply to every single community around the country, but they may provide some guidance as to how important population density is versus being close to a transit station. So we do mention that a little bit and direct the user to references that talk about how those models were created, and that way you can get a little bit more guidance about weighting from that perspective. So again, you have the flexibility to choose whatever weights you want.
All right, thank you. Next question, this is a little bit longer. In our area, there is no data on ped bike usage to justify the need for these facilities. Another reason to resist installing these facilities is that there are no ped bikes seen in the area, also making it hard to justify the need. But the real reason there's no ped bikes is that there's a lack of facilities and unsafe conditions that keep people from feeling safe to go out in their cars and use the streets. How does the APT deal with those issues?
That is an excellent question. Yeah, so I think that a lot of the demand factor and demand variables are really based on their proxies for demand. So if you have certain conditions, land use conditions, population, whatnot, you can assume that there's at least some latent demand for bicycling and walking. I think some of the reference materials that we include in the guidebook would point the user more to kind of how to well, let me just put it this way: the app you could use it to show relative demand in an area, and there are other tools out there that and certainly lots of research that shows, if you build it, they will come given certain factors. So I think a number of the references that we include in the guidebook point the user to those, and there's some more that have come out even since we've done the research on this on this project. Bob, did you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. I'd just say the APT is no substitute for a strong, well-informed advocacy community. However, if there are people who do want to push for better facilities for walking and biking and better land uses supporting walking and biking so that they're more convenient, that the advocates could take a look at this tool and say, hey, it's easy enough for us to get some data, put that into the tool, and share it with their local agencies so that they could consider it. On the agency side, if you want to be working more closely with your advocates, you have a tool that can show your process very clearly. And so I think it helps with that dialogue.
All right, thank you. My next question. If an agency likes to give more emphasis on safety, they can modify the weighting factor. How about the severity of crashes? For example, focus on K+A type crashes that most agencies are concerned about per MAP 21 requirements.
Yeah, I think we have a number of variables suggested in the guidebook, from total crashes to injury only or fatal crashes, and then there's the flexibility of adding additional variables to reflect what your needs are. So yeah, the tool definitely would accommodate being able to incorporate the type of crash data that MAP 21 requires.
You could create, if it's not already in the tool, you can create a severe crash variable, a fatal crash variable, an other crash variable, and give them each slightly different weights.
All right, thank you. Next question. We are aware of the challenges in predicting ped bike crashes using HSM predictive methods. Was there any consideration given to incorporate safety performance using HSM predictive methods as opposed to using historic crash data?
Bob, you want to take that one?
I'm trying to think of how that would apply in our situation. So you can account for the historic crash data using the safety factor and variables representing numbers of crashes that you see at certain locations in your system. The HSM would essentially give you some sense of how the local design characteristics of a roadway might lead to experiencing future crashes. So you should be able to plug in either past crashes or expected values for future crashes as different variables. I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you. And I think this will be our last question. What was the most challenging task in writing or developing the APT program tool?
Well, I think in the beginning, after we had conducted the research, really was deciding what are the key factor categories that should be included and what to call them. I mean, I think a lot of agencies that we reviewed use similar factors, but they call them, they have different names for them. I think also the variables, you know, we as you have seen, we've really tried to ground the variables in the best available research that's out there, and you know, we debated whether or not we should really highly recommend certain variables or just include variables and point people to the research that sort of backs them up. And I think there was a lot of debate around that. We ultimately did take a softer approach. I mean, we included the various variables, but did not necessarily say you should definitely use these variables for this purpose. What do you, Jim, Bob, do you have any other thoughts?
One thing that occurs to me and that I thought was challenging was that trying to make the apt work for all types of agencies at all different levels of government, regardless of their technical capacity and resources. That was a very important thing for the panel that oversaw this process, that whatever we developed should be usable by all different types of agencies. And so that meant that we couldn't assume that an agency would have GIS capability, for example. We had to develop something that was general enough and flexible enough that it could work for all those different types of agencies.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for discussion. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question. A PDF copy of the presentation slides is available at pedbicinfo.org/webinars, and the APT tool will be available soon at pedbicinfo.org/APT. We'll post a recording of today's webinar to the webinars page as well as to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/pedbicinfo within a couple weeks. Be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/pedbic for updates on when the video is available as well as when the APT tool is available. I will post to our Facebook page when it's up and ready to go. I want to remind you that there will be a brief survey that appears once the webinar is ended. We very much appreciate you taking your moment to complete it. And I want to say thank you again to our speakers, Michael Hintz, Jim Elliott, and Bob Schneider. And thank you to all of you for attending today's PBIC Livable Communities webinar.